Welcome to the All Things Bright and Beautiful podcast. I'm Jenna here with my co-host Lydia Shelley, and this is a discussion of life, books, and theology from a confessionally reformed Christian perspective. In this episode, we'll be discussing Frankenstein by Mary Shelley. We're using Karen Swallow Prior's guide to reading and reflecting on Frankenstein, and she uses the manuscript of Frankenstein first published in 1818. We hope that you enjoy today's episode. Welcome back to this episode of All Things Bright and Beautiful. Lydia, it's great to be here with you.
Hey, it's good to be back.
Lydia and I actually just went to the beach together a few weeks ago. We had a trip with our families and were able to spend a few days at the beach and had a great time. And I was kind of joking because I was reading our current book that we're going to be discussing tonight at the beach, and the setting, I guess, of where we were really was a stark contrast to what we're going to be discussing. Yeah. But I'm very excited to discuss it. I think we were both talking even before recording this, just how much we enjoyed reading and all of the, I think you would probably echo what I think, that there's so much we could discuss. Mm-hmm. It's kind of hard to condense it down, into a short podcast episode. Yeah. So tonight, as we said, we're going to be discussing the book Frankenstein by Mary Shelley. And just to give a little bit of background on the novel, Frankenstein was actually first published in 1818, and then there was a later edition that came out in 1831. And so the first edition was written Mary Shelley first published it under an anonymous name, and then kind of later came out published under her name. And the later edition includes some I guess, edits to the story, as well as apparently, I think in the earlier edition, her husband, Percy Shelley, who was a famous poet in the Romantic era, made some edits to her work that I think maybe she changed some of that in the later edition. And so most of the editions that are out today are that later 1831 edition, but the book that we're using, Karen Swallow Prior's Guide, she actually chooses to use that earlier 1818 edition. Anyway, so the story is about Frankenstein, who a lot of people think, based on kind of modern adaptations of the book and movies, that Frankenstein is the monster in the story, but Frankenstein is actually the scientist who creates this creature and this monster. And so it tells the story of Victor Frankenstein, who's a young scientist who creates this creature in a science experiment and kind of gives life to this monster. And throughout the book, it's a story of it's written in what's called a frame narrative. And so it's actually written some in letters and some in various perspectives, various stories from different people. So some of the letters and the stories are told from Victor's perspective. Some are actually told from the monster's perspective. And then the whole story is kind of framed in the beginning and then the very end in Frankenstein's friend, Walton, who discovers him while he's, I think, out in the Arctic, I guess, right? Yeah. On a ship and finds Frankenstein. Right. He's on an expedition. Yeah. Right. He finds Frankenstein. And so the story kind of starts and ends with him finding Frankenstein, and then Frankenstein telling this horrible tale of everything that's happened to him. And then, like I said, there's parts where the monster's story kind of is woven into that.
Yeah, so I probably with the interesting thing about Frankenstein is when you first sort of read it on just a basic reading, you don't know any of the sort of background behind it. You don't know anything about Mary Shelley. You just get this tale it's one of the first sci-fi monsters. I think she's actually credited as the first Industrial Revolution science fiction novel. And so you get this it's a masterful tale of this monster, and she has sort of that Romantic era writing, which just draws from nature and is really detailed in a lot of the descriptions of things. And so you get the picture where you really do feel like you're kind of immersed in the story, and at the time would be very frightful. And I think sometimes when you read it and you think, well, this is a little bit fantastic. He brings a body to life with electricity. But at the time, Mary and her husband at the time, Percy Shelley, had attended some different lectures that were considered highly regarded as scientific about this animation through electricity. So if you think of it in those terms, at the time she's writing it, she's taking a picture of what was current science.
Right.
And spinning it into this tale of sort of science gone wrong in a lot of ways.
Right. So I guess, in our modern day, you should think of it in terms of something that would seem really feasible to us in our modern day scientifically. That would have been very feasible to them at that time.
Right, exactly. I mean, you could take it into a lot of our bioethical debates.
Right,
you have a lot of this idea of life and death and that kind of thing. And so she's framing it within that, which is just really brilliant she started writing it around 16 or 17 years old. So she's very young when she wrote it, but it's just incredible. So some of the background on her, though, as you read it, there's a much deeper sense that Mary is talking about herself in a lot of ways. It's kind of almost an autobiographical novel. And it skips around and trying to figure out who is she actually framing as who. But as you read it, you start to and you understand where she's coming from and what her own background is and the culture that she's living in at the time, and a lot of the big ideas that are coming up. We have romanticism, which we talked about, which is the idea that that passion over reason and just a lot of these just emotional responses are very important, and a lot of this self-actualization is very important.
Right.
And so she's
and this, I'll just interrupt you real quick. This is considered, in addition to the first scientific fiction novel, this is also considered a work of romantic fiction, and was written during the Romantic era, and she's certainly heavily influenced by the romantic poets and her husband Shelley, and
right. And her parents too. So her parents were also both famous writers. They were William Godwin and Mary Wollstonecraft. They were both philosophers and writers, and they had just radical ideas coming up in the time that they were like espoused free love, and they scorned marriage. They said that no one should get married,
even though they were married,
which they got married because she was pregnant with Mary at the time.
Right.
And both her and Percy Shelley considered themselves disciples of her parents. And so all of those ideas were kind of what she was brought up among. She didn't know her mom. Her mom died at her birth, but she grew up reading her mom's books. And so she just considered herself very much like in step with what her mom thought.
And Mary Wollstonecraft, if you're not familiar with her, wrote one of her most famous works is, I believe it's called On Vindication of the Rights of Women.
Right.
And she was part of the feminist movement.
Right, in England.
And so, that's kind of a little bit of her background.
Yeah. And so if you see a lot of these ideas that they had and she kind of grew up in, and then Percy, her husband, although they didn't get married right away again until she got pregnant, they kind of come into the book, and you if you look at Victor Frankenstein as sort of the ideologue, and then Mary almost puts herself in the position as the monster, and she's sort of in this position because her parents espouse this idea of free love. Don't get married. Marriage is an institution that's bad for women. So then she meets Percy Shelley, who her father knew and highly regarded. She was 16 at the time. Percy Shelley was 22, I think. So there was a 6-year difference between them.
I think he was married to someone
He was
else,
married to another woman and had left her and came to their home. There was a lot of complications with money. Money was kind of always involved with all of them. So she falls in love with Percy, runs off with Percy. And so she thinks my father would approve of this because this is just me following in the footsteps of what both of my parents said were good things. Her father disowns her and won't affirm any of what she's doing, won't talk to her anymore. And so she has this feeling of rejection, which is a lot of what we see reflected in the whole book. And so looking at it and seeing, if you look at the creature of her seeing herself in that position, I think shifts a lot of you start to see that it's not, you can look at it as, yes, it's ideas about scientific things, but I think it's also she's sort of pushing at us consequences of even our ideas in general. Like, what does that do when we have big ideas, radical ideas? Does it have a consequence that's big?
Yes, absolutely. And I think another significant thing about her story is that she lost, I think her firstborn child? Or?
She lost 4 children.
I know she lost, several children. And so the version of Frankenstein we're reading, as I've mentioned, is by Karen Swallow Prior, and she does a really good job of giving a brief introduction into Mary Shelley and then just into kind of some of the themes in Frankenstein, and then she has discussion questions after each volume of Frankenstein. So there's 3 volumes to Frankenstein, and she has questions after each. And so one thing that she brings up, just given Mary's background and her history, is that she says that Mary was haunted by death in her own life, and not just death itself, but death tied to creation. So death tied to birth of children, essentially, seemed to be a major theme in her own life that certainly has a large role in her novel.
Right, because her mother died giving birth to her.
Right.
She suffered from 1 miscarriage, and then she had 2 more children that died. They also, surrounding the lives of the Shelley, there were 3 different people that committed suicide. 2 of whom were Percy Shelley's former wife, who committed suicide, and then, which in a lot of her journals, Mary sort of puts on herself, because she's the woman who he left his wife for.
Right.
And so she has this very big sense of death sort of following her. Yeah.
So is there anything, I know you've done a lot more reading about Mary Shelley than I have. If someone was interested in learning more about her, is there a certain book you would recommend?
Yeah, so there's a book called Romantic Outlaws by Charlotte Gordon, and it actually alternates between Mary Shelley and her mom, Mary Wollstonecraft. So each chapter follows their life, and it's a little confusing to kind of do it that way, but it makes for very interesting, because so much of Mary Shelley's life was shaped by her mother's ideas. Like she even says that she learned to read at her mother's gravestone by tracing her name. I think Karen Swallow Prior mentions that in the book, in the introduction. And so she really she tried to even follow some of her mother's ideas around the country, because her mother was heavily influenced by the French Revolution. She went to France during, as all of the reign of terror was happening. And so even in some of their travels, when she traveled with Percy Shelley, kind of after she left her father's home, they traveled all over the world, like not all over Europe. And she tried to sort of follow around her mother's pilgrimage of sort of freedom, I guess you could say. So following both of their biographies is really helpful to, I think, understand where Mary Shelley was coming from. Right. And to see how her ideas were really shaped. I don't necessarily agree with a lot of what Gordon comments on her, the history is very solid. I mean, a lot of the things that she talks about are well known. If you were to go to Wikipedia, you would find them. And so she's very good about talking about all of the actual historical events, but some of her commentary I would not necessarily agree with. But it's still a good source, I think, to kind of get your feet wet in it. Right.
Yeah. And so this, as by all accounts, as far as we can tell, Mary Shelley certainly wasn't a Christian and isn't writing this book from, I guess, a Christian worldview. So what is the value? Why are we? This is actually, this is our first departure from, I guess, a kind
Christian
of a Christian author. Yeah. So what is the value of talking about Frankenstein?
Yeah. So I think Mary would probably, in her writings, you could see her as maybe a deist. She would still recognize a creator, and that's some of what her commentary ends up being in Frankenstein as well. But her husband, Percy Shelley, was an atheist. He was actually kicked out of university for his atheistic thoughts. A lot of his poetry really hints at that. So she was heavily influenced by atheism as well. A lot of their friends, the poet Byron was also one of their really close friends and traveled with them. He was also a big atheist. So, yeah, you don't get Christian themes necessarily when you read Frankenstein. However, as you read it, I think you really do get a picture of kind of like we talked about way back in our very first episode about reading books that sort of show the hollowness when we exclude God, I think. And I think that's what you see in Frankenstein is what happens when mankind actually has their fate in their own hands. And it's not pretty. Yeah. It's really not.
And it isn't. I do think it's a complex novel that I found myself wondering, and kind of am still wondering, what did Mary Shelley believe about God, and what is she trying to say about God in her novel? Because I think sometimes we can oversimplify it and think well, she's saying that science is bad and God doesn't exist, and that might be true, but I think it's actually a lot more complex than that. And so I found that very interesting, just thinking through many of the different, I think she poses a lot of questions in her narrative that she doesn't really give answers to, but they're great questions to think about and things that we can discuss with other Christians and also with non-Christians. I think they bring to light a lot of the things that we grapple with just as human beings living in a fallen and a sinful world.
Yeah, I think actually what I love about her is that she doesn't give us answers. Yeah. She really does just kind of present. And I think it's because you get the sense that as you're reading it, that she's really kind of criticizing the life she's currently living. Because she did write it. So she wrote it, in the middle of their sort of travels.
Mm-hmm.
And so it was right in the middle of when her father had rejected her, right as she's not married to Shelley at that point in time. She's very faithful to him. She has no interest in anyone else. You don't get that sense from Shelley having the same fidelity towards her. There's a lot of there's not a lot of confirmed things, but there's rumors of him having affairs with multiple different people around her.
And even I think there's a rumor of him being in love with like her sister.
Yeah,
or
her
cousin
sister.
or,
There's
kind of
it's unsure if
yeah.
So her sister got pregnant. They're unsure whether or not it was through Byron or Shelley.
Yeah.
There's just a lot of drama surrounding them.
Yeah.
You kind of get the sense that you're like listening to like My Chemical Romance sometimes, because it's very dramatic and
very
like
dark and
very dark
yeah.
and just like the ultimate sort of like emo tale a little bit. Like there's just a lot of darkness surrounding it, but you really do get the sense that she's kind of questioning the very ideals that she's living.
Right.
So but I think part of the reason she doesn't give answers is because she's still living them. So she hasn't rejected them necessarily, but I think she's still kind of through this novel working them out, while also working out that this idea of losing her babies and just a lot of different things. And I think that's why it's so valuable for us to read, because those are really good questions to ask and to not just be given the answers by the person writing it. And then, taking our Bibles along with us and saying like, where does the Bible diverge from this? And where do we see the differences? And where are the answers that she doesn't provide for us?
Right.
Are they in Scripture?
Yeah. Yeah, and I think it is a good, as I mentioned, something great to discuss with Christians and non-Christians, and to just think about, these are questions that we need to think through ourselves and have our own thoughts about, and they will likely, hopefully, will be different than Mary Shelley's, but that doesn't lessen the importance of our need to think about them. And I hope also, if you haven't read Frankenstein, our hope is that you'll still get a lot out of us discussing this. We do hope you will read it, but even if you haven't read it yet, our hope is that you will enjoy the discussion, and really in all of our episodes we aim to use books as kind of a launching off point to talk about important topics and things and have conversations that matter. And so our hope is that you would read many of these books, but even if you haven't, that you will still get a lot out of what we're saying.
Yeah, it's not like a literature class where you have to make sure you've read it before you come to the discussion table.
Yes.
Yeah, we talked a lot about even just how death and life are really intermingled in in her thinking, because she's thinking of birth, but then with birth, she's experienced so much death. Right. And so I think that theme of life and death is just kind of woven all through her book. And you kind of come to the question, and I think it's really interesting to think about, because you have Victor. He has this singular ambition to create life and to sort of, he wants to bring what he calls like the Philosopher's Stone and I can't remember, like something elixir. But in order to change humanity's fate and to make sure, basically to bring immortality to humans. And so that's kind of, he wants to play God. Right. And you very much get that sense that as he's talking about it. So he's reiterating his tale to Walton, who's picked him up in the Arctic, and basically telling him about this ambition that he had and how he pursued science, but also the occult, and alchemy and all these things, and mix them together in this aim to really be God. And you have this like sort of arrogance underlying a lot of what he says. But then he brings this thing to life through electricity. So he's patched together this creature from, I think it's human parts, but also animal parts, if I remember correctly. Or is it just human parts?
I don't remember. I know it's just a lot of body parts.
Yeah, and it's all kind of patched together. And if you've ever seen like a Frankenstein movie, they're all it's like this hideous stitched together thing. And it's really interesting because before he animates it, he has this sense that it's beautiful, and he calls it his creature. Right. And then he electrifies it and it comes to life, and almost immediately he talks about how it's grotesque, and then he calls it his enemy, almost like maybe like 3 pages later. It's not very long before he switches that. He's filled with horror kind of immediately. As soon as he brings it to life. Yeah. But you kind of do look at this and you kind of go like, well, what does it, like, is the creature human? Is it possible for us to bring life to something that was not in any way like a human life to begin with? And like, where does the soul enter? The creature tells us he has a soul, but does Victor have the power to give a soul to something? And so I think it really does give us this sort of thing to think through of I think the quote that the creature says, so the creature, eventually they meet together. He finally tracks down Victor, who's kind of run away from him. It's a long time. The creature has learned how to talk, and all this stuff has kind of happened in between. And he narrates to Victor his experience and how he felt being rejected by Victor. And one of the things he says to Victor is, who was I? What was I? Whence did I come? What was my destination? These questions continually recurred, but I was unable to solve them. And so you get this picture of this creature saying basically like, who am I and where did I come from?
Right.
And he gets no answer from Victor, which I think as Christians is just such an interesting parallel, because then you have in Christianity, we ask that same question, like, who are we? Where did we come from? And what's our purpose? We don't say destination, but we say purpose. And as Christians, we do have an answer to that. And you have this sort of contrast of creation story where you have Victor creating this creature and being appalled. Right. And I think Mary did this. She would have been familiar with the creation narrative. And so I think she did that intentionally. When in contrast, you have God creating man and breathing life into him. It's not this mechanic. So Victor does it mechanically with electricity and machines. God does it in this intimate, loving way, and then he calls it good. Right. And so just thinking through how magnificent that is, that we do have a God that creates us in that way, and to think of what sort of that picture she provides of what it would be like if we did have a godless world. Like, what are we? What is our purpose?
And even the monster himself draws a contrast between, he talks about how even God created man in his own image, and yet essentially he says, I'm not created in anyone's image. And that I found that fascinating, that he even recognizes that. So she is clearly drawing parallels to the Genesis narrative and to creation, and that we do, as you've said, we do have an answer to why we exist, that we exist for God's glory, and that we're created in his image, and that we are created, by a loving, beneficent, good creator, unlike Victor Frankenstein, who immediately is horrified by his creation and does not love his creation.
Right. And it's just so self-absorbed. Like, that's just the sense you get from him of like, there's no love really, any sense of love that you get from Victor.
So I guess kind of along the lines of what you're saying, later in the book, there's a quote actually by the monster that Karen Swallow Prior kind of makes the argument, or not an argument, but she poses a question that leads us to think that this is one of the passages that kind of encapsulates the entire novel, and I tend to agree with her. I think it does. And just to give a little background before I'm going to read this quote, but essentially what happens a little bit later in the novel is the monster, he follows a family. He lives in the woods for a long time, and he actually does good for them. So he like brings wood to them, and he loves them, and he learns their language, and he's just waiting until he can befriend them, and he hopes that they will love him, and he ends up encountering them, and they're immediately horrified by him and want to kill him. And so it's then that's at that point, he says that's the first time that he ever feels a desire for vengeance, or feels kind of an evil desire. And before that, really, he says his desires were good and benevolent. And so that happens. And so there's a quote by the monster later in the novel, and he's saying this to Victor Frankenstein. He says, "Remember that I am thy creature. I ought to be thy Adam, but I am rather the fallen angel, whom thou drivest from joy for no misdeed. Everywhere I see bliss from which I alone am irrevocably excluded. I was benevolent and good. Misery made me a fiend. Make me happy, and I shall again be virtuous." And so the monster is asking Frankenstein to create basically a woman monster, a wife, and that's and we'll I'm sure talk about this a little bit more later, but that's a kind of a major theme throughout the novel, really from Victor Frankenstein and from the monster, is this solitary life and isolation and a desire for companionship. And so the monster wants him to make him a wife, and he thinks that if he could just have some kind of companion like him that looked like him, then he'd be happy, and he would no longer need to do these evil things or to be miserable. And so what did you make of this quote? Like, do you think that this does kind of encapsulate a lot of the themes of the novel or the meaning behind the novel?
I think so. I think that Well, and you also, we talked about romanticism a little bit before, and I think that's an important element to keep in mind as you read Mary Shelley is this idea that, so the Romantics also believe, they followed Rousseau's thinking. Bear with me as I throw out a bunch of names. It's worth it, I promise. Rousseau thought that that people were inherently good, and that it was society that corrupted them. And so you do get that sense as the monster. So the monster sort of, or creature, starts in nature, and he's fine, and he survives on whatever is there. And as he gets closer and closer to civilization, he encounters more and more evil. And so you get this idea that she builds up the novel towards saying, the closer you are to civilization, the more wickedness there is. And that's not because man is inherently bad, but because society corrupts them. And that's very much in line with the Rousseau and both of her parents, who were heavily influenced by Rousseau, and that Romantic movement. Percy Shelley would have agreed with the same idea, which, yeah, so I think she's very much building that picture. However, you still do get sort of, again, I think she still kind of questions her own philosophy, because you do get a sense that both Victor and the creature dismiss a lot of the wicked things that they do, and blame it on other people, and yet you still see them as villains. And so you don't, like, as you sort of read it, you're like, I mean, yes, I can sympathize with you, but you've done such wicked things, and the blame is all, and it's like you've witnessed good as well. Like for the creature especially, he witnesses this loving family who have suffered. They've faced injustice, and yet they've responded in love and in loving one another, and yet he still chooses vengeance, and he's so quick to just switch. So I think on the one hand, yes, she is saying that people are inherently good, and yeah, I think there is still like a hint of question about that.
Yeah, and I think too, it's helpful to understand the Romantics they have more of a humanistic understanding that the creator is wrong to make a creation that doesn't ask to be born, essentially, which certainly would not coincide with our view, our Christian view, but that therefore the creator bears a greater
responsibility
weight or guilt than his fallen creation does. And I think you can see that
for sure,
kind of in her novel, that the monster does bear guilt eventually, but that it seems like Victor Frankenstein bears more guilt because
he's the ultimate
created
villain.
This monster. He's kind of the ultimate villain. And I think you can make the argument that, I think Karen Swallow Prior says this in her book, that Victor exemplifies what's called the Byronic hero, which is basically a character who has, the hero can be a misleading term, and
it's not positive.
The Byronic hero is not a positive thing, and that it's someone who's typically guilt-laden and kind of alienated and haunted by some kind of mysterious guilt and all these things that are characteristic of Victor Frankenstein. And so I think understanding even that aspect of her novel did, as we kind of just talked about, made me even more thankful for a creator who is good, and who does have good motives and who does love us and certainly loves his creation in spite of our sin. So a very different picture than this picture that Mary Shelley gives us.
Yeah, it is really interesting, because I think sometimes when we look at the Victor creature comparison, we look at it and we think like, oh, it's like God and Adam, but even the creature points it out, and you, like, the creature has been reading, he learns to read from this family he finds in the woods. It sounds really random when you just start telling
it's hard to explain the whole thing.
But he takes from them the book Paradise Lost, by John Milton. I said I don't know why I couldn't remember his name. And in that's the fall of Adam. It's a poetic retelling of the fall of Adam and Eve, and in it is a very central character of Satan. There's a lot more expanded on him.
I don't mean to interrupt you, but I probably should have mentioned that quote that I just read is in that passage where the monster is talking about reading Paradise Lost, and he talks about how he loves it and kind of almost viewed it as his own history. And so when he's talking in that quote about himself being the fallen angel, it is an allusion to Satan in Paradise Lost, which is a very central character, I guess, in Paradise Lost.
In fact, Milton was very heavily criticized for how attractive he makes Satan, because people were like, we sympathize too much with Satan, and I think that's the sense that you get from the monster, is like, you should sympathize with me. I didn't ask for this.
Right.
I mean, that's not what Milton is trying to communicate. I think it's much more complex than that, obviously. But yeah, you get the sense that it's not a God-Adam relationship between these two. It's a God-Satan relationship, which I think it makes a little bit of a shift between sort of their rivalry that comes out more towards the end of the book. Yeah.
So one of the themes that I kind of just mentioned that I found particularly interesting, and I really appreciated Karen Swallow Prior brings up in her introduction, is this theme of solitude and isolation. And so we see, first of all, that Victor Frankenstein makes his kind of all of his discoveries and his advances in isolation, and seems like bad things kind of happen when he's isolated. And so Karen Swallow Prior makes the point. She says, and I'll just read some of this because I thought it was so good. She says that the modern church has placed much attention on teaching about and serving the family, and we have given less attention to friendship, often substituting mentoring and accountability relationships for the genuine companionship for which human beings were created. In centering friendships and the desire for and the desire for friendship in the story, Frankenstein invites us to consider the importance of companionship in our lives, as well as the danger of not having good friends. I just thought that was so important, because I do think that is often very true, that things like teaching about the family are good and important, and God has ordained the family, and that, but so all of that is good, but that we can, I think, in the church often do that to the neglect of talking about how the church family is also our family, and how we need spiritual friendship, we need companionship, and that God has created us with that desire, that's a good desire. And so I just found that, I think, in the novel, you see the absence of that, and what that leads to. And so you see just the evil that comes from Victor Frankenstein working in isolation, as well as the monster, who certainly throughout the novel talks about his longing for companionship and for friendship and for someone like him, and that if he just had that would make him happy and would keep him from doing these evil things. Now, whether that's true or not, I don't know. But that it is an interesting thought that I think Mary Shelley is presenting to us, that kind of the evils that happen when man is alone, or when man doesn't have this companionship, and then that really isn't what we're created for. Right.
And like the depth of friendship too, because so you have Walton, who's the expedition, he's sailing in the Arctic, and he finds Frankenstein, and he expresses, he's writing letters to his sister, and he just says, I just want a friend, essentially. And so you do get this repeated theme even with Walton that's framing outside of the narrative of wanting a friend, and he sees Victor Frankenstein as sort of this friend. And I think more what she's getting at is having a friend who does share that sort of, I don't want to say ideals, but kind of that idea, which we have in the church. Right. And I think that's that there is something to that idea of, we have this shared vision, and we have this shared these shared central things that knit us together. And that is what people desire, and that's where we thrive. We thrive with friendships that are like that, and not friendships so Victor does have friendships that are throughout the book, but you don't get a sense that they're good friendships. Some of his friends are good. Victor is not a good friend. Right. He's all about himself. He's very very much about his own selfish ambition. He neglects his friends when it's convenient. He goes to them when he wants them. Even with his relationship with his cousin, who then becomes his wife, you get this sense that it's just all about himself. And so she really does sort of set up this idea of like, what about, do we require, or would we benefit from the right type of friendship? And again, she doesn't answer it, but I think that desire is there, and I think that's a desire that all of us have. Yeah.
And we would say, I mean, we know from God's word that there's certainly many proverbs about, I mean, I can't quote a specific one right now, but essentially that you become the company that you're around. I'm totally not quoting that correctly, but that's the idea, and that you good friend, those who are your friends do influence you, certainly. And in addition, that we are certainly throughout, especially the New Testament, we see so many one another's of Scripture, like the things that we can only do together. So there's so many ways we cannot fulfill Scripture unless we are in close fellowship in the church with other believers. And so we can't live the Christian life in isolation. And so I think that's certainly something we can apply to our own lives, and that I often think about and pray for and often see my need of is close friendships that do spur me on and point me to Christ, and that it can be, I think, easy because we get busy, because we're selfish a lot of times, frankly. Right. It's easy to neglect friendships or to maybe miss the importance of them until we, I think, all of a sudden realize, oh, I'm lonely, or I need that, and that to let that kind of be a warning to us that we need friendships, we need fellowship, we need community, and that we need to fight to not neglect those things. That I think for a lot of people, I know for myself, my natural bent can often be to neglect those things until it's almost too late. I mean, that sounds really ominous, you just are desperate. Yeah, right. And that just to fight against that and to really make relationships a priority, even in the midst of the busyness of life.
I think too, like, you get the sense that in the very beginning, as he's starting in on this venture with the monster or the creature. I mean, they call it, I don't know. I use it interchangeably. He becomes a monster. Starts as a creature, becomes a monster. But he isolates himself, I think, largely because he knows what he's doing is wrong. And so he does have friends who are kind of asking after him. He has his father who is asking after him and kind of warning him, like, to stop meddling in what he shouldn't. And he intentionally isolates himself for this singular ambition. And I think in the same way, we isolate ourselves because of busyness, but I think we do it when we're sinning too, because we want to hide. We want to hide what we're doing from others, when that's actually when we need friends the most, and we need to let them into what's going on in our hearts, because they can stop us in a lot of ways. They can be the wisdom that speaks into that. Like, if you just imagine if Victor had a friend that had stepped in before he had done that, how, like, you wouldn't have a story. But,
no, that's a very interesting point, and I think is very true that often when we are in sin, or when we are feeling ashamed or whatever, maybe that we that I think Satan tempts us to isolate ourselves, or to feel like either no one will understand or no one will accept you, and that is a lie, that is really truly when we most need relationships and friendship.
So we talked a little bit about Victor just kind of being a jerk, essentially. I mean, that's how I would sum it up. But just how he is just loveless. Self-absorbed and, just like all the things you don't want to be. But you don't get a sense that he knows how to love anyone, really. I mean, he rejects the things that he's created. He's not great to any of his friends, rejects his dad. Yeah, so he's just not an awesome guy.
And even with him, I think her characters are so complex, because even with Victor Frankenstein, I did feel some sympathy. Like, I felt sad for him.
You're nicer than I am.
I
wasn't sympathetic.
I guess I felt sad that he is blind to.
Yeah, that's true.
And he even says at the end of the novel, like, so he... the monster says that this is a spoiler alert, I guess, if you want to read it, but that he will see him again on his wedding day, essentially. And so it's pretty obvious, like, he knows something bad's going to happen on his wedding day, but he just assumes the monster's going to kill him on his wedding day. Which I'm like, it seems pretty obvious he would probably kill your bride.
He's been killing everyone else around you.
And so he even says, like, he's just kind of describing this and says, I was blind to the monster's meeting. Like, and I thought that was so interesting. Like, I think in a lot of the novel, he is blind to his own faults, certainly. Yeah. And I guess I had sympathy for that, because aren't we the same way?
That's true. That's a good point.
We are often blinded by our own sin and completely unaware of our sin.
And how destructive it is.
Yeah. So we need other people. We need them to speak into our lives and to help us see those things.
For sure. I do think the theme of love, like Victor's sort of lack of love, and the monster's desire for love. I mean, he desires a wife so that he can sort of share in, and part of that is friendship, but part of it is also love. I think, but the monster also has like this conditional love, right? So the moment he's not given what he wants, he is immediately like, okay, well, I'm just gonna exact vengeance. I'm gonna kill everyone. Like, it's just like happens immediately. There's no pause between it, and so you don't get the sense that he's an entirely loving creature either. And whether or not that's because of other people's fault or because of the monster, that's a different issue. But I think surrounding Mary's life, you do have this idea of love, because I mentioned before this idea of free love that she lived around, and just this sense of sort of love unmoored from any sort of fidelity. So she had a sense of being faithful to her husband, but that wasn't returned to her, and then she lost the love of her father. And
by free love, you might want to define.
Oh yeah,
you mean essentially. You love
anyone you want, however many people you want.
Yeah.
So they believed in just, you can have as many partners as you want. No monogamy, no nothing. Yeah. And actually marriage is of the worst of things. They married, but it was mainly for societal reasons.
Right.
And so I think that idea of love is very connected to a lot of what she's writing. And I think that's why with Victor especially, you have this sense that Victor Frankenstein is sort of a picture of her father. But I think you could make the case that it might also be Percy a little bit. Some of the descriptions, even if you read a little bit of biographies about Percy Shelley, they're not too dissimilar. Percy Shelley was really volatile and very very haphazard in how he pursued life, because he had this sense of this sort of romantic ideal of finding his own self-actualization at any cost. And I mean, you see sort of the detriment that happened around him. His first wife kills herself. A lot of people think it was because of him. Mary Shelley's half-sister was also considered maybe in love with Shelley. She also killed herself when he refused to take her with them when they left. They also took her other sister. And then he had another friend who was part of their group, and he ended up committing suicide. So there's just a lot of sort of destruction. He also had 2 children with his first wife, whom he tried to get custody of, kind of, but not really, didn't really care about them. And you also don't get a sense in her journals or his that he had any care for the children that Mary had through him. And so you do have this sense that he doesn't have fidelity for people, or that so much of his ambitions for that romantic ideal just pushes away everyone else around him. And so I think perhaps Mary had an insight into what she was living with him, as you kind of see Victor, wreaking that havoc around him. And I think that you get that sense with a lot of what Percy Shelley, he radicalized a lot of these ideas about free love, and he was an atheist, and he was a big proponent of socialism, and he used his poetry to sort of bring these radical ideas before people and to try to change society. And he really did accomplish that in a lot of ways. His poetry was really really highly regarded. He's he's the best known romantic poet, I would say. And his ideas really did shape ahead. I think we still see a lot of his ideas. I mean, the idea of free love whoever you want, seek your own self-actualization, at all costs, because that's the ultimate aim of your life. He still influences people that way. And I think when we can look at Frankenstein, and whether Mary Shelley meant this or not, you can still look at it and see our ideas have huge consequences, and they can be really detrimental.
I think this is changing lanes a little bit, but I think another thing that's very interesting is that Frankenstein does attempt to create life as a man without a woman, and kind of like just removes women from the equation. And then the monster isn't given a name, that he remains nameless, and just kind of this idea, I guess, of motherlessness throughout the book, and kind of a lack of women. I mean, there are some women mentioned in the novel,
they're
but not
big characters
really involved.
at all.
Yeah, and I think it is certainly it's I guess kind of removing, you see in Mary's own life these sad, unfortunate ties between things like sex and death and childbearing and all these things. And so I think those are difficult and sad realities to grapple with, that I think she's trying to grapple with in this novel. And she's essentially removing procreation and women from, I don't know if I want to use a birthing, but creating, creating something. Yeah. And just, it's an interesting portrayal of what happens when God's, I don't think this was her intention, but that I see it as, when we stray from God's created order and his design, the havoc that wreaks,
So just changing lanes just a little bit. She subtitles, so the title of the book is Frankenstein, but she subtitles it The Modern Prometheus, which is really significant particularly if you know anything about the myth of Prometheus.
Why don't you tell us
Yes.
a little bit about it?
So Prometheus was a Greek myth. There's a couple different versions of it. It's essentially, he's I believe a Titan, don't quote me on that. So he's one of the sort of like the layers of gods, and he goes to Mount Olympus and he steals fire from the gods, especially Zeus, and he brings it to humans. Now it's kind of confusing because it's fire, and you're like, well, what significance is that? It's essentially, he's credited with giving humans innovation. And he makes the gods very angry, and as a result, Zeus chains him to a rock and has his liver pecked out, and it regrows and it gets pecked out again. It's very gruesome. And you don't get any sense, and Prometheus has zero remorse for what he's done. He has this sort of like heroic figure of he's the reason, because he had sympathy on humans, that he brought fire to humans and innovation and all these wonderful things. The interesting thing about the Prometheus myth is in the original, I need to find the name of the guy so I can say it correctly. So Hesiod, I think is how you say it. I never say Greek names right. So that's the original tale when it was first told.
Okay.
When Prometheus brings innovation to Earth, to the humans, it's followed almost immediately by Pandora. And so Zeus gives Pandora as sort of like the entrance of females into the human race. And if you know anything about Pandora, if you've heard the term Pandora's box, it's basically she peeks into this box. She was told not to look in it. She peeks into it and she lets out all evil on the human race. So all evils go back to Pandora. And so you get this sense in the original tale of Prometheus that with this innovation comes great evil. And so I think, now Mary Shelley might not have referenced that one originally because later myths of Prometheus omit Pandora. And so you don't get that sense of like with the innovation comes this evil. But in the original, that's there. And I do think that you still do get that sense in her book. So I wouldn't be surprised if it was the original that she had in mind when she labeled it the modern Prometheus.
And so why do you think I guess, what ties do you see to that in her novel? Why do you think she gave that the subtitle?
So I think with what Victor is doing, he talks about, I mentioned earlier, this idea of the Philosopher's Stone. The Philosopher's Stone is this idea that it can turn anything into gold. Is that right?
I think that's right, yeah.
Yeah. And so it's this like innovation for humans. It's kind of like you hear all these different things like the Fountain of Youth or the Elixir of Life or all these different things. And there are these myths that exist to basically say humans can have immortality without God.
Right.
And so that is what you get with the sense of Victor is he's looking for being sort of the master of his own fate. And for vanishing death from humans.
Right.
And so he sees himself in a lot of ways, I think, as Prometheus. And so as she paints him, I think you do see he's successful. He does animate life, right? So that's this successful experiment in science, and yet with it brings nothing but trouble.
Right, yeah. And I do think it's significant that she brings the modern Prometheus into the subtitle in addition to bringing Milton into the book as kind of two I don't know if you would say contrasting, but kind of two different views of the divine will and of man's involvement in that. And she talks about just that. So in Milton, he says in the opening that the purpose of his poem is to justify the ways of God to man. And so that type of defense is what we would call a theodicy, and it attempts to explain essentially the goodness of a God who allows evil. And so kind of in the modern Prometheus is a very different view of that. And I think that it's just interesting that she kind of interweaves both of those into her story. And it does seem like she is, I guess, shifting away from a defense of God into kind of accusing those who desire godly power, like Victor Frankenstein.
Yeah,
like she's
sure.
kind of accusing man trying to become God,
Yeah.
you know? And I think Karen Swallow Prior maybe says this, but that she kind of makes the arguments that the Romantics would have I guess related more to, or even seen Satan in Paradise Lost instead of Christ as kind of the more heroic character, which I think is just helpful in understanding her novel and kind of the view that perhaps she's coming from. And it's interesting, I think, even in our modern day society, as you've said, ideas certainly have consequences, and that we can still see a lot of that in our modern day society, that I think the kind of like autonomy and a bit ambition and just this unbridled ambition that Satan kind of has in Milton's Paradise Lost, but also that certainly Victor Frankenstein has in her novel is what our modern day culture in many ways values.
Yes,
and yet
for sure.
She's showing the danger of that unbridled ambition.
Right. Yeah. And you even get this idea of ambition with Walton in the very beginning, because so he goes on this expedition and they get, the expedition to Arctic at that point. I can't remember if it's before or after when Shackleton went on his expedition to the Arctic and gets stuck and has to save all of his men. But essentially, like at that time period, a lot of those expeditions were happening and a lot of people didn't make it back. So Walton is doing this expedition and his men beg to return home. It's kind of near the end of the book. And Victor tries to convince them to stay, and basically saying like this ambition is greater than anything else. Walton and spoiler, I guess we already plenty of spoilers.
Yeah, but, don't listen to this.
But like Walton does eventually decide to turn back, which I think is an interesting contrast to Victor, who refuses to turn back from his ambitions. Right. And that is a big part of like that Promethean idea of ambition being the ultimate aim, which, like you said, in Paradise Lost, is Milton paints that negatively. That is like the ultimate point of sin when Eve falls, is because she pursues that instead of trusting God. Right. Whereas the Promethean myth, it's cloudier, and I think it's maybe a mix of both in Frankenstein. Yeah.
It made me think of Shelley. Well, actually, one of my favorite poems by Shelley is called, I never know if I'm saying it right, I think it's pronounced Ozymandias. Oh, okay. I don't know if you're familiar with that, but it's actually a really short poem. It's very quick, easy to read, but it's basically about an ancient Egyptian pharaoh. I think it's about Ramses II. But so Shelley is describing, he's coming up to this crumbling statue of Ozymandias, and it says, the statue engraved on it says, my name is Ozymandias, King of Kings. Look on my works, ye mighty in despair. And so it's this very godlike kind of statement, and yet the statue's crumbling and everything around it is bare. And so his point that he's making is that even this great king, this godlike figure, is now crumbling away and kind of withering to nothing, and it's just this statue that has kind of been forgotten. And and he, I think, is making the point in the poem that poetry is what outlasts, what lives and what lives on. And so I would argue that not poetry, but that Christ and what we do for Christ is what outlives ourselves. And so, but I do really love that poem, because I think it is, as Christians, there's a lot that we would agree with essentially in it, and that we can take from it. And I'm trying to remember what I had a connection to what we were talking about with that, but I guess just going back to ambition, that I do think this novel serves as a warning for where our ungodly ambitions can lead us, and helps us to, I guess, in contrast, it made me think about, well, what should my ambitions does it mean I don't have any ambitions? Right. Like, what do you think that it means as Christians?
I think so. I thought of I can't remember what book I was reading about it in, or maybe I looked it up somewhere else. I don't know. I had a lot of things. I was going everywhere when I was reading about all this. But Thomas Jefferson, upon founding the University of Virginia, which is considered like the first secular institution or university, one of his things that he said was illimitable freedom of the human mind is sort of like he put it kind of as their motto, I guess. So I think Frankenstein gives us this picture of the illimitable, it's such a hard word to say, knowledge and invention. And I think we see that maybe that's not the ultimate aim. But I think when we contrast that to, like, say, Christ, of this idea of the truth shall set you free, you have sort of like these two ends, and learning how to pursue and like that's talking about knowledge, but I think ambition fits well into that as well, because I think those all kind of go together, of this idea of how do we pursue things in a way that's Christ honoring. And I think I think Frankenstein is a really good example of what not to do, where it's this selfish ambition that's all about our own glory. And it's about what we can accomplish with no sense of any sort of submission to anything bigger than us, as opposed to the truth is Christ. And if the truth sets us free, we submit to Christ and we pursue everything in order to glorify him. And I think with that sort of check in place, our ambitions will be in the right place. Yeah, amen. Yeah. And I thought of 1 Corinthians 2:2. Paul says, "For I decided to know nothing among you except Jesus Christ and him crucified." And that I think, I think sometimes in probably a good motive to not be ambitious in a worldly sense, we think then therefore I should have no ambition. And that's also not silly, the case. Yeah. But that our ambition does have to be rooted in Christ and in his glory. And that Paul certainly provides a good example to us of that he made it his aim to know nothing but Christ and him crucified. And that is what he boasted of. And so our ambition should be not for our own glory, which certainly, as Frankenstein shows us, will lead to ruin, that pride will come before the fall, but that we should be ambitious for the cause of Christ and should ask ourselves, what can I do that will leave a legacy that outlasts myself, again, not for my own glory, but for Christ. And it just provides us with, I think, a important contrast to the worldly ambition, I guess you could put it, that we see in Frankenstein. Yeah, you mentioned before, you gave the Percy Shelley poem, and I think it's really interesting because you look at the Romantics and you can be like, I disagree with so much, as a Christian, I disagree with so much of what they said, but they were reacting to the Enlightenment, which again, there's a lot I disagree with in the Enlightenment. And so I think you can see, but there's also some things in both camps that you can agree with. And I think what you see kind of on either extremes are just these very human reactions in trying to explain the universe without God and without what God says. And so you have the Romantics, especially kind of reacting with this and trying to explain away sin and say, it's just circumstance. And you even get that sense with Victor a little bit, where he kind of blames his father, and there's always this blame shifting to something else. What I think is really interesting about the Romantics, and who, again, Rousseau basically said that we come as Locke said it, that we come as a blank slate, that all that we learn comes from outward. There's no original in us, and so there's no original sin in all of that thinking. So the Romantics didn't have that sense of we're responsible for the sin that comes from us. But it's interesting because they say it comes from society, right? But where does society come from? True, it comes from us, right? And so I think that as you sort of sort through the Romantics and all of like what Mary Shelley is bringing forward, and if you read Percy Shelley as well, going back to kind of remembering that God says that sin originates in us. It's in our hearts. It's not outside of us. Yeah. It's not from, like, other things play into who we are, but ultimately we're all the monster, right? And we're the monster at his worst without Christ. Amen. I think that's just a really important thing to remember as we engage with a lot of these ideas, that just to kind of remember what Scripture does say of our heart is deceitful. Yeah. We can't follow our hearts in order to find anything good. And that we believe in original sin, that we are our sin. We have inherited the sin of Adam, that Adam, his sin nature is our sin nature. And that as Reformed Christians, we believe in the depravity of man and that we are born corrupt. Psalm 51:5 says, "Behold, I was brought forth in iniquity, and in sin did my mother conceive me." And so that we are born in sin, we are born depraved. And that, as you said that only by God's grace through Christ can we, be saved from that, but that there's nothing in ourselves that can change our nature. And so it is a very different view of the nature of man than the Romantics would have. Right. As you said, that they would think that those societal influences are what corrupts someone. And we would say, no, that's in all of our hearts, that we're all born with that. Yeah. I was reminded of Jeremiah 2:13. Just the whole book sort of reminded me of this. So in Jeremiah 2:13, God is condemning the Israelites, and he says, "My people have committed two evils. They have forsaken me, the fountain of living waters, and hewed out cisterns for themselves, broken cisterns that can hold no water. And I just feel like that's what you see Frankenstein do. He denies the God who actually brings life, and he makes this broken cistern, essentially, that can't hold, that it doesn't hold anything good. And I think that seeing it in that light of the ultimate evil that we commit is rejecting God.
Well, we hope that you enjoyed today's episode, and we would encourage you to check out Karen Swallow Prior's guide I'm calling it a guide, so it's essentially there's an introduction that introduces the book and some of the themes, and then it is just a copy of Frankenstein, of the manuscript of Frankenstein. But we would encourage you to check out her guide and to potentially read it with someone else, or as I mentioned, this would be just a great book for a book club or something like that. Great opportunity to even involve some non-Christians as well, and to discuss this work of fiction that really does bring out so many important questions. So thank you so much for being here with me tonight, Lydia.
Yeah.
Thank you for joining us today. If you'd like access to more resources, we have a website at allthingspodcast.org. We hope that you'll join us for our next episode.